In 1982, two gentlemen by the name of Jeff Silbar and Larry Henley wrote a song that was recorded by several different artists throughout that decade, including Lee Greenwood and Gladys Knight and the Pips. The song, though, came to its status of greatest hits after Bette Midler sang it as part of the soundtrack to the movie Beaches. Do you know the song? It must have been cold there in my shadow, to never have sunlight on my face. You were content to let me shine. That's your way. You always walked a step behind. So I was the one with all the glory, and you were the one with all the strength. A beautiful face without a name for so long. A beautiful smile to hide the pain. Did you ever know that you're my hero? And everything I would like to be. I can fly higher than an eagle. You are the wind beneath my wings. Has anyone ever sung that song to you? Have you ever been anybody's hero? Now, most of us would probably not be comfortable claiming the hero status, even if it were offered to us. But even if no one has ever labeled you a hero, what about admiration? Have you ever been the object of someone else's admiration? Has anyone ever said to you, I sure do admire you? How'd that make you feel? Warm and fuzzy? Maybe kind of uncomfortable? I've always said, don't put me up on a pedestal. I might break something when I fall off of it. I got thinking about people in my life who have captured my admiration, and there are so many. I went back through the Rolodex of my memories, and so many names I could come up with. But after reading the story from our scripture this morning, it struck me how many of those people on my list of most admired have something in common with the character in our story today. For they too are widows. Some of you are widows. Perhaps not normally a term worn with pride. There is in the word itself the pain of loss, oftentimes loss of a lifetime partner of many years. But I have to tell you, I cannot imagine how poor my life would be, or the world would be, without those who carry the title of widow. Widows and other single women, by and large, have carried the water and kept the doors open at every church I've ever served or been a part of. If it had not been for the widows, very little would have gotten done, and not much money would have been in the treasury if it were not for the widows. From widows like Jenny Ruth Smith and Willie Lee Washington, who I learned more about how to be a pastor than any class I ever took in seminary. From them, I learned so much. Jenny Ruth would accompany me on pastoral visits, or perhaps more accurately, I would accompany her on pastoral visits to the homebound. She carried tape recordings of the worship service at Toxaway United Methodist Church, where I served for 20 years. She carried that tape along with a church bulletin every week to those who, because of health, could no longer leave their home for church. And those folks looked so forward to her coming. And oftentimes while there, she'd help them out with something they needed done in their home, or ran an errand and helped them out with something that they needed picked up. When the neighborhood around her home there on East Whitner Street became more and more marked by abandoned houses and rentals with folks moving in and out, and sometimes leaving a mess, to clean up after them. And her family saying to her, Jenny Ruth, you got to move. It's time to move out from here. Well, she said, no, this is my home. And she stayed, and she kept being a good neighbor, especially to the children of that community. You see, she was a pastor and a social worker, all rolled into one, and she didn't have a license or a degree, and she was a widow. Widow Willie Lee Washington was the first African American to become a member of the church over there on East Whitner Street. Now that's not quite so unusual today for folks to cross racial boundaries on Sunday morning, but you know, back in the 1980s here in Anderson, South Carolina, it was not common, and it took courage. Willie Lee was nearly 80 years old when I met her in 1994. She drove a brown 1964 Chevrolet Impala that had a wheelchair lift bolted to the roof because she cared, at age 80, she cared for her profoundly physically and mentally disabled niece, whom she brought to church every Sunday faithfully. Willie Lee always had with her this bank bag, on the outside of which she had written in large letters these words, church sack. And she claimed that she unexpectedly would receive money from various sources, and when she would receive that money, she would put it into the church sack. And out of that church sack, she would pay rent and utility bills and buy medicine for folks who were in need. She swore that every time she learned of a need, the next thing she knew, the money would come to her in just the right amount. And into the church sack it would go to take care of the need. She was like Robin Hood, but without the stealing. And in her 80s, she volunteered to help elementary school children learn how to read and write. And in the summertime, she would put on her nail apron and pick up her monogrammed hammer, and she would join the Suckahatchee Summer Service Camp program that the Methodist Church does, where folks help repair homes in low-income areas of our state. Now, I'm told that they would not allow her to climb up on a roof. One summer, we had a summer program over there at Talks Away, and one summer, we took the children, many of them from the neighborhood, to the skating rink over on Highway 29, and even though she had never done it before, and despite her pastor's advice that she not do it now, she insisted on putting on roller skates and going for a whirl around the rink. You see, I learned from ladies like those two ladies and many more that it doesn't do much good to argue with the widow. Now, the woman in our story today has gained the notice of Jesus. Jesus is in the temple in Jerusalem, and he's watching the offering being collected. Now that's sort of an awkward thing. I try not to watch who's putting something in the plate or who's not. I know some preachers do. I was in a church once visiting where instead of the offering being collected by passing the plate, the congregation was asked to get up out of their seats and bring their offering forward, all the while were the preachers watching. And when after the first round it didn't seem like there was enough in the basket, the preacher said, okay, I'm going to ask one more time, you come by that basket, and this time you give like you really care about God's word. Jesus has noticed this woman's offering. This widow woman living on much less than a Social Security check has placed her gift into the basket, and although in terms of dollars and cents it's not the largest gift made, in terms of percentage of total income, it puts all others to shame. You see, according to this story, this widow woman, who can barely pay her rent, has, in the words of Dabo Swinney, gone all in. All in. And standing around her are the religious leaders of the day. This story is also a commentary by Jesus on the religious elite of his time. And one commentator on this passage said about them, the religious leaders delighted in the way people greeted them with respect, if not deference. The religious leaders also loved to make a big spectacle of striding forward and sitting in the important seats in the synagogue where everyone could see and admire them. And what's more, he said they loved sitting at the head table at every church function. And on top of all that, the religious leaders loved to offer long and flowery prayers for the sake of making a good impression. And while those actions may have seemed spiritual, Jesus warns that they are signs that the religious leaders especially enjoy the attention they are receiving. However, Jesus points out that the religious leaders of his day don't just crave attention. They're also hungry for material things. So Jesus grieves how they devour widows' houses, exploiting these defenseless people. He portrays those religious leaders as being the animals or dragons that devour their prey that is vulnerable. So while they preen like pious saints, they actually act like wild animals that wolf down widows' possessions. Jesus warns in our scripture, while ravenous religious leaders may get all they'll ever want in this life, they may have swiped people's attention and widows' homes for next to nothing. But in the end, Jesus warns, they'll pay an exorbitant price. There will be no reward for them. But as for this widow woman, she's been lifted up by Jesus as one who is admired by God. Can you imagine being admired by God? What is it about her? Does her meager little gift really make a difference? That's often a reason or excuse that we give for not stepping up, isn't it? Oh, I don't really have much to offer. It doesn't really matter if I'm there or not, if I give or not. It doesn't matter if I make an effort or not. Who am I? What difference can I make? A writer by the name of Mark Chernock tells this story. He said, every Sunday morning, I take a light jog around a park near my home, and there's a lake located in one corner of the park, and each time I jog by this lake, I see this same elderly woman sitting at the water's edge with a small metal cage sitting beside her. He said, this past Sunday, my curiosity got the best of me, so I stopped jogging and I walked over to her, and as I got closer to her, I realized that the metal cage was, in fact, a small trap. There in that trap were 3 turtles, unharmed, slowly walking around the base of the trap, and she had a 4th turtle in her lap that she was carefully scrubbing with a spongy brush. Hello, I said to her. I see you here every Sunday morning, and if you don't mind my being nosy, I'd love to know, what are you doing with those turtles? And she smiled and she said, I'm cleaning off their shells. And she says, anything on a turtle's shell, like algae or scum, reduces the turtle's ability to absorb heat, and it gets in the way of their ability to swim, and it also can corrode or weaken their shell over time. Wow, that's really nice of you, he exclaimed. And she went on, she said, I spend a couple of hours each Sunday morning relaxing by this lake and bringing these little guys out. It's my own strange way of making a difference. But don't most freshwater turtles live their whole lives with algae and scum hanging from their shells? He asked her. Yep, she said. Sadly, they do. He said, I scratched my head and said to her, well then, don't you think that your time could be better spent? I mean, think of your efforts, and I know they're kind and all, but there are freshwater turtles living in lakes all around the world. And 99.999% of those turtles don't have kind people like you to help clean off their shells. So no offense, miss, but how exactly are your efforts truly making a difference? And the woman sort of laughed. And she looked down at the turtle in her lap. And she scrubbed off the last piece of algae from its shell, and she said to this writer, she said, "Sweetie, if this little guy right here could talk, he'd tell you, I just made all the difference in the world." Yeah. This widow woman is making all the difference in the world. I like that story. This woman has gone all in, and God admires that. We don't see it that often, people going all in, taking risks. Some might even say, walking on the edge of crazy. You're going to do what? You really thought this through? You really think that's a good idea? To give your all? As we noted, today's Veterans Day. Now, we don't know the names of most of those who have sacrificed life and limbs so that the rest of us could do what I hope you did on Tuesday if you were eligible. And after what countless of those unknown and unnamed soldiers have done, if you didn't figure out a way to get to the polls last Tuesday and cast your ballot, well, then I don't know what to say. Seems sort of ungrateful to me. What makes people put themselves out there and go all in and take risks and give everything they've got? It seems like when it does happen, it creates a bond that is never forgotten. Preacher and writer Tony Campolo tells this story. He says he was on a train leaving Victoria Station in London years ago, and there was two other gentlemen in the compartment where he was riding, and he said they were about 10 minutes out of the station when one of the men had an epileptic seizure. He slipped off the seat and onto the floor, trembling and shaking, and as soon as he slipped off his seat, he said his friend, the guy who was with him, rolled up a newspaper and inserted it between the man's teeth to keep him from biting his tongue. And when the seizure was over, his friend lifted the guy up and helped him back onto the seat. And he took off his coat and put it around his friend to keep him warm. And then he turned and spoke to Tony Campolo. And the guy said, "I hope that didn't upset you too much, mister. We never know when these seizures are going to occur, but he hasn't had a seizure for more than 2.5 months. He said, you see, we were in Vietnam together. He's British and I'm American. And we were both seriously wounded. I lost my leg." And he said the guy pulled up his trouser leg and showed him his artificial limb. And he went on to say, he said, "My friend here had half of his chest torn away by the explosion of a hand grenade. And there was shrapnel all through his chest, so he couldn't move without feeling excruciating pain. And the helicopter that was supposed to come and take us to a hospital was blown out of the air by an enemy rocket. And that seemed to be the end of all of our hopes. But he said it was then that my friend somehow got up on his feet. I don't know how he did it, but he reached down and he grabbed a hold of my shirt and he began to pull me through the jungle. Every step he took marked by agony, and he screamed in pain with every single movement that he made. And he said, I yelled at my friend that he should save himself and that there was no way he was going to get both of us out of the jungle. But somehow he did. He said, 1.5 years ago, I found out that my friend had this epileptic condition. And he said, I sold my condo in New York City, and I got rid of my car, and I came over here to London to be with him because he has to be with somebody all the time. He said, we never know when those seizures are going to hit him. And that's our story, mister. Maybe knowing it'll make it easier for you to